In this lecture, we will be taking a closer look at social institutions and how they are an important agent of social control. We will focus on something that has historically been very important to the work of sociologists regarding this particular connection, which is religion. In modern society, social institutions are recognized to be the primary agents of social control, and in this case, social control relates to decision making, how you as an individual within a society makes a decision, and that decision results in this case in some sort of behavior. The idea is that the social institution is contributing to the wide range of social values that you are connecting with and referencing as you make your behavioral decision. Since the mid 1970s, a great deal of research in sociology has examined the relationship between religion as a social institution, a very important social institution, even in secular society, and its impact on social values and individual behavior. Now, with regard to this, there are two areas of focus in sociology. First, sociologists look at community level religiosity and social solidarity, and I'll define those for you. So, again, first, community level religiosity and social solidarity. And then the second, they've looked at levels of religious group affiliation and criminal activities. Crime and deviance has been something that sociologists have looked at with regard to social institutions, especially those affiliated with, in this case, faith communities or faith based communities. Let's take a look at that first focal area for a moment. What is religiosity? In sociological circles, basically, religiosity is a measure of your religious expression, your spirituality, how that works its way into decisions that you make, and of course, behaviors that you contribute to. These behaviors would include affiliating yourself with a religious or faith based community. It would include, in this case, how you express your spirituality, your faith. It would also connect to your participation in that community's activities. Things like attending worship services or getting involved in particular committees that might be associated with, in this case, the workings of that religious community. Social solidarity is a pretty important concept in sociological circles. It ties us back to the ideas of Emile Durkheim and the role of religion as a social institution in the mind of the worshiper. Social solidarity relates to this notion of the interactions between individuals within a religious institution. The idea is that as we participate in ritual, as we participate in activities associated with our community, a few of which I just mentioned previously, we create a kind of social solidarity or a bond between individuals within that faith tradition. And this bond has been something that has been extrapolated on by many theorists within sociology, but also anthropology. The idea that the bond is so tight, it creates almost a singularity in that community. The idea that we are are bound together, our social relationships are so tight because of our faith tradition and all of the social values that come along with it, that we are almost inseparable from one another when we participate in activities relating to that community. So, if you are a person of faith, or if you recognize yourself to be a person of faith, spirituality is almost a human universal, but sometimes people will reject that concept. But the idea here is that if you have ever worshiped as part of a spiritual community, that feeling you get, that effervescence, as Durkheim would identify it, that connection that you feel with those around you and those participating in ritual or the activities associated with a particular faith based community, That is that solidarity. It creates very close bonds, almost family like bonds. In fact, in many faith traditions, worshipers will recognize each other rather, as citizens of one faith, or they might recognize themselves as part of a single body of a deity, in this case, the body of Christ in a Christian tradition. Or they might identify themselves, in this case, as being part of a Christian or religious family. I reference Christianity just because of my faith traditions, but you can apply this concept sociologically to virtually any religious community or any faith based community or any faith tradition, in a sense, as long as it's incorporating an aggregate of people, a group, a community. And that's what allows it to be lifted to the level of a social institution. So, religiosity, social solidarity, they're very, very important. And we look at the functionality of religiosity and social solidarity as it relates to human action and behavior. Then there is that second level, in this case, religious group affiliation, and the idea of deviance or deviant behavior. What we find is that people who are connected with a faith community statistically have a much lower chance of participating in behaviors that are seen as criminal in nature. They are, in a sense, pushing against a much larger, wider array of social values that are antithetical to nonconformance or nonconformancy. The idea here is that your faith tradition is not telling you per se to conform to every social norm that is associated with a government or a society. What it is doing is it is, in a sense, giving you due process or giving you a sense of how you should have your voice heard, or how you should, in a sense, achieve a particular social or economic level within that society. And generally, that will align itself with the mores, the norms of a society at the time that a religious group is functioning. So we'll take a closer look at some studies that have tested that idea as well. Robert Bursick and Harold Gramsmick are two sociologists who, in the early 1970s, took a look at the relationship between social organization, the strength of neighborhood community interactions, and local patterns of crime. And a lot of their findings can be tied back to both religious social institutions, but also social institutions in general. And they very much incorporated family in this study as well. What did they find? Well, what they found, and we'll kind of break it down into a private, public, and parochial levels. At a private level, they recognized the strength of local families, parent relationships, parent child interactions, patterns of interaction, and the idea of a strongly expressed parental role in the life choices of people within that private sphere. And again, this was or related to curbing deviance in local communities. So, to kind of condense that down, the family and the functionality of the family was very, very important in ensuring, in this case, conformity to social norms, or the idea of pushing back against patterns of deviance in local communities. So again, they're looking at these three levels of control. There was a public level of control, in this case, local uses and social relationships relating to community businesses and organizations. This could be local stores. When we talked about ethnic enclaves, the idea of or the role of a store that serves a particular population within a community can be very, very influential. But they also took a look at schools and, of course, faith groups. The idea here is that if you have a sense of community that develops geographically, such as a neighborhood, and you have a series of social institutions within public social institutions within that geographic construct, or how that is being defined, maybe neighborhood in this case. And when people live in that community, and when they are served by public institutions inside of that community, it creates a pretty strong bond that is hard to overcome when you're making decisions that might not, um, in a sense, conform to the expectations of others that live in that community. And of course, when you're making decisions that might in some way, shape, or form violate their rights. So public institutions were also seen as important in curbing, in this case, deviant behavior. And then the final piece, which connects to what we're talking about in this lecture, which is parochial, providing services for parishioners, and in this case, the church body would be doing that, supporting interpersonal relationships between parishioners, and then between parishioners and local public institutions, so reaching out into the community. And that's what you'll see in a lot of faith-based communities and social institutions within these kinds of neighborhood and city designs, that there will be an intentionality to reaching out into the local community, not only for maybe an evangelical kind of purpose, but also for establishing or growing roots in that community and making bonds with people in that community, and then reaching out to people in need. Very often you will see food pantries being part of a faith community, and how they serve uh, the local neighborhoods, or the local city. Again, creating these bonds, these interpersonal relationships, and they found that in situations, especially metropolis kinds of situations, where you have, or metropolitan, where you have faith communities that are connecting or making strong interpersonal connections with the surrounding landscape, that it was very much curbing, in this case, um, deviance, and it was actively feeding the idea of social organization and social control. Now let's build on this last piece here, how institutions are mechanisms for social control. Bursick and Gramscick also incorporated some examples of how this was being studied and tested. Uh, Again, in this case, looking at in the Chicago study that they highlighted, how community churches were providing services to the surrounding neighborhoods. And they found that to be very, very important. So the Progressive Community Church of Chicago's South Side was highlighted, and they again were identified as a very good example for how church communities can connect and actively help to um, foster social control in a metropolitan environment. This Southside community houses a community center that provides food, daycare. There are youth programs, even diaper services that the church was becoming involved in. And they found that that was extremely helpful in not only serving the community, but also giving people normative pathways for being able to care for themselves and those in their households. Another study that I felt was very, very important. This was a 1995 study that was highlighted by the New York Times. They reported on a variety of Manhattan churches that were becoming involved in community-based projects. 60%, they found, of Manhattan churches provided services to both their members and non-members, and that was also seen as something that was extremely helpful in giving people maybe the ability to interview, have the resources to interview for jobs, to get those jobs, to find housing. Again, all of the things that really push back against any sort of need for deviance, and really also services that help to create greater equality between people in those neighborhoods, in those metropolitan communities. So a very, very powerful example of how, in this case, private, public, and parochial institutions can work together to be able to, in a sense, push back against this notion of social disorganization. And so we'll take a closer look at that next. The idea of social disorganization is now a school of thought in American sociology. However, it first appeared in the early 1940s, so it hasn't been there really from the start. Many sociologists early on were studying urbanization and how the process of urban development and urbanization was contributing to juvenile delinquency or juvenile crime. Social disorganization has continued to look at this, but of course it has expanded as not only a kind of a theoretical perspective, but also a topic in sociology to a variety of groups within urban and rural environments. Social disorganization, in terms of its causality, has been recognized to be a product of at least three specific things, and they really tie in nicely to our course. First is the notion of poverty. When you have, in this case, a gap between earning potential for populations or groups within a society, social disorganization internally to those groups can occur. So poverty is definitely one contributing factor. Another big contributing factor geographically to social disorganization is high population turnover. And we see this in areas, especially in urban areas, where you have a lot of rental units and you have a lot of populational turnover. People are not necessarily able to develop the kind of interpersonal relationships that social communities or communities in general are designed to have or require, in a sense, to be maintaining their healthy social structure. And then the last thing is ethnic heterogeneity. In this case, when we start to see ethnic groups, ethnic and racial groups, being a little bit more isolated from one another in rural or urban settings, when there's not good relationships between those populations, this also results in what sociologists recognize to be disorganization. And this is another important theme in this lecture series, which is being able to break down barriers between ethnic and racial populations within society, and we've really been looking very closely at American society. So the question then we have to ask ourselves is, how are our social institutions addressing these three major categories? How are our social institutions attempting to prevent poverty? Or how are our social institutions attempting to, in a sense, reduce the gap between earning potential among groups within our societies? How are our social institutions actively trying to have families and individuals have more stable living environments? Probably right now, the only solution that is being tested regarding that in many of our urban environments is home ownership. But I think that home ownership is something that is not the solution per se. I think having a living environment that you take pride in and that you remain in for long periods of time, if not your entire life, as a member of a society, is really more of the answer that we will be looking at in years to come. The reason for this is because I don't think there's enough housing for people. You look at how our populations are increasing and particular elements within our populations increasing, especially in urban environments. We just don't have the resources to provide a home to everybody and every family that is in that environment. So the idea here is that yes, home ownership is important, um, but the idea of finding other ways to inspire people to live in a community and be a part of community for a longer stretch within their lifetime, I think is probably a better way of looking at that. And then in terms of ethnic heterogeneity, taking pride in the diversity that exists within our social environments and developing and supporting social institutions that bring together people of a wide range of social and ethnic and even racial backgrounds, I think is very, very powerful. And again, faith communities by their nature uh, appear to be doing this and historically have done this. So that's why in this particular lecture, we're really focusing on the social institution of the church. So social institutions, in a sense, have been traditionally capable of maintaining social control. However, as local populations continue to change, as we start to see greater inequality between groups within those populations, and as the populations themselves continue to urbanize and to expand numerically, we see that many of our social institutions are taxed to the point where they're unable to, in a sense, contribute to patterns of social control the way that they historically have. And this can be seen from something as small scale as the household or family and something as large scale as the city. Or maybe a city municipality on its larger scale. So the idea here is that we have to kind of go back to this and see what is creating discontinuities in our social network, in the structure of our society, and how we can better serve social institutions that, again, by their design, can contribute to better measures of social control. So anything that created or creates discontinuity between an individual taking advantage of a service has been historically recognized as being a disorganizing force. And so connecting also social institutions of a particular scale, maybe a public level or higher, to individuals is going to be another important practice within this process. In 2000, sociologist Dinah Rose studied social disorganization and the need for social order in Chicago's South Side neighborhoods. She studied, in this case, over 176 churches and the services that they provided, again, to parishioners and non parishioners. In terms of her finding, she really broke things down into tiers or percentages, percentage scores regarding these um, study churches. She found that about 98% of the churches she was surveying offered some sort of community counseling. This could be mental health and physical health as well. Again, helping people in need, helping people to be able to make better connections socially, economically, even politically. This very much was important to the process, and we see this continuing today. About 47% of her church communities provided food pantries, and then about 34% included clothing pantries. And she found that many of these services included uh, clothing that was designed to prepare people for job interviews and things like that. Now, today, it's been quite some time. Today, we see that some of these services have been expanded to include, in this case, job training, housing, a variety of resources, and that is very, very important. 20% of those living in local neighborhoods specific to the south side of Chicago were seen in 2000 as being in a or living in a state of poverty. And so she found that many of the neighborhoods that these churches were serving, again, about 20% of the individuals in those neighborhoods were actively in a process of living at or below the federal poverty line. What did she take away from this? Well, uh, Dr. Rose found that she felt, or in this case, she found that religious institutions were the best resource for being able to connect individuals and community or households within um, these local communities with the services that they needed to succeed. She also found that these institutions were a primary resource for being able to push back against more institutionalized inequalities that were manifesting themselves in the local community or on the local community. So she recognized in this case 6 reasons for choosing churches and supporting churches when we're looking at trying to push back against social disorganization and when we are trying to support social control. First, she found that churches were the first to be on site. They were kind of in the trenches regarding more impoverished areas. So that was an important reason to support these faith-based communities. Second, they were fairly stable due to their need to develop strong affiliations within their denominations. So they had a institutional mission per se. Third, she found that faith-based communities were generally diverse by their nature. They brought people with many different backgrounds together, and allowed them a common ground with which to communicate and make connections. So things like civic interests and individual skills could be brought together in one location. Fourth, church communities or faith-based communities were wonderful resources for promoting activism within the community, getting the community's voice out to particular kinds of local organizations that then would take that further up the kind of social hierarchical scale to get to leadership in local communities. Fifth, by their evangelical nature, many of these were Christian in nature, they were actively building connections between themselves and secular groups around them that shared the same space. And this included even other social institutions such as schools. So the idea here too is that the church was a wonderful resource because by their nature, or by its nature rather, there was this push to reach out and to share the good news with not only people and households, but also other organizations in the local community. And then sixth, they often were building other support organizations. So they were supporting and building other social institutions. They sometimes had their own schools, or they would support a local school. They very often would include counseling services. They very often would include other kinds of services relating to providing food and resources for households in the local um, landscape. So, or cityscape in this case. So again, religious institutions for Dr. Rose were important. They were an important starting point to be able to, in a sense, push back against a lot of the problems of the urban landscape. And the south side of Chicago was one area where this was being actively tested. So real quickly to go over these 6 again. Churches were no stranger to impoverished areas within urban and rural environments. They were seen as number 2, very stable because of their strong affiliations with their denominations and even other denominations. They had a mission statement per se. Third, they were by their nature diverse, so they brought people of many different civic interests, ethnic and racial backgrounds together, as well as people of different skill sets. Fourth, they promoted activism. Fifth, they were evangelical, and the nature of evangelical pursuits relates to this idea of reaching out. And then six, they often would build connections with other organizations or build other social organizations that were designed to help people in the local community. Well, in terms of some of her findings, I'll summarize these for you as well. The general assumption was that there is a positive relationship between demographic poverty and disorganization. The idea here is that when you're looking at poverty and disorganization, they have statistically a positive relationship, or there's a positive correlation between these two phenomena. This is not a positive concept in a value sort of way. It's very, very negative. We don't want poverty. We don't want disorganization. But in terms of a research relationship or an experimental relationship, there was a correlation between measures of poverty in urban environments and measures of disorganization. She also found that in neighborhoods where community organizations were present in very high numbers, there was a corresponding decrease in variables that related to not only disorganization but also disorder. And that included crime, measures of crime. So in neighborhoods where you had strong community organizations that were being supported and that were active, there was a corresponding reduction in disorganization and disorder. She also found that where there was a greater expression of racial or ethnic diversity, there was not greater signs of disorganization, but in fact, when you had social institutions supporting greater diversity of voice, when they were becoming more active, and there was an activism piece in these institutional designs, that the more diverse the environment, racial or ethnic, and even civic, the more positive the expression of a decrease in disorganization was being measured as well. So the idea of diversity and cultural heterogeneity was actually something that was helping the process along. Also, where residential mobility was high, there was a decrease in social order, and there was, of course, expressions of disorganization and crime. However, multi-service organizations were much more successful where mobility was high. So the idea of, when you saw that people were moving in and out of the community and not developing those relationships rather, when you had an organization that was actively addressing that, then that was kind of taken out of the realm of possibility for a contributor to disorganization and disorder. So again, that awareness can also be something that can push back against more residential mobility. However, correspondingly, when residential mobility and population density were at work in a community and there wasn't any sort of supporting structure coming from a local institution to curb their effects, you were seeing their contributions to social disorganization and disorder. So in terms of some general trends that were part of this process and things that she was noticing, on Chicago's South Side, there was a disturbing trend in the 2000s, and it continues unfortunately today, but we have seen a reduction in it. Over the 15 years that Dr. Rose conducted her study, nearly 75% of those studied were found to live in the same household. However, there was still around those households fairly high residential mobility. Sometimes even within the household, specific family members. And she found that the family was a social institution that was a bit at risk in these communities, and that if there wasn't some sort of community organization that helped to support those families financially or otherwise, they were also, in a sense, unable to push back against social disorganization and disorder. Population size was also seen as an important factor. Again, as I said before, areas of greater population density were seen to have increased measures of disorganization. However, where community organizations increased in number, and where churches provided a greater suite of services, social disorganization was then corrected. So again, everything is kind of connected in some way, and everything is pushing back against one another. And so the idea here is that, what do we do as members of a local municipality, as maybe as politicians? Well, we support these organizations that have a measurable impact on social control and social organization, even in light of the problems of the city. The idea of greater physical or the greater residential mobility, and then, of course, situations having to do with poverty rates and population density. Dr. Rose and others working in urban environments have also highlighted the concept that these problems that they are witnessing firsthand in urban environments are not necessarily restricted to just places like Chicago or New York, but they are endemic to quite a bit of American society as it relates to diminished measures of social organization and social control. For example, poverty rates do contribute to greater residential mobility. Greater residential mobility does correspond to greater problems in community organization and higher rates of crime in those same areas. Correspondingly, as well, where secular neighborhood programs are prevalent, there is less support for religious programs. However, if those secular organizations are able to contribute to the local community in the same way that a religious community does or has historically, the same kinds of benefits and effects are also being witnessed as well. Now, since the late 1980s, there has been a decline in crime rates in the United States. We have seen this especially in areas where local municipalities have supported secular and sacred community organizations and social institutions that, by their nature, develop these strong interpersonal and intergroup relationships. If we extend the trend even further, we can see general crime rate declines in similar areas since the Second World War period, or since the late 1950s. However, at the same time, we do realize there are some facts about our society that speak against this general trend. First, that the United States leads the world in rates of crime and incarceration. We are express the highest per capita incarceration rates across the globe. We also, within incarceration, express the longest periods of imprisonment among developed countries. So this is another thing that speaks against trends of social control that we've seen since the Second World War, and speaks for the need for continued attention being paid to these social institutions that can develop greater cohesiveness in our societies. We spend on average over $42 billion annually to feed and clothe our prison populations. If this amount of money was able to be turned outward, turned back into our communities, again, it demonstrates the power of the dollar and how we could definitely support those social institutions that are able to bring more social order and social control to our urban and rural environments. Let's take a closer look at historical trends with regard to crime and this overarching theme of disorganization. In terms of a crime boom in the United States, we really see that as occurring between 1961 and 1975. Statistics having to do with crime investigation during this period of time identifies robberies and homicides as increasing, over 100% annually. So think about compounding interest, 100% annually. Rape and other violent crimes, aggravated assaults and such, increased by nearly 200% annually. So this is something that really turned a lot of focus, or drew a lot of attention with regard to the work of sociologists. Gary Lafree was a sociologist who attempted to explain the historical spikes and periods of decline as we see not only between 1961 to 1975 in terms of an increase, but then that decrease in the 1990s, which is another trend. In terms of his conclusions, he recognized a number of exogenous effects, those independent of national crime policies. So a lot of what he was looking at in this case was not as much the result of public policy, whether it was an increase or a decrease or leveling out, but in this case it was external effects that were rooted in the society itself. So the first point that he makes is this notion of economic stress. When you don't have national or international events like war to inject money into all of the productive classes of society, and you have increases in joblessness and a decline in median household income, especially in the middle class and the lower economic class households, you generally will see a spike or a rapid rise in crime. And that was something that was happening between 1961 and 1975. When you pair this with an increase in social strain, people not feeling really capable of reaching or achieving the goals that they have, it compounds. Also, when you see an increase or some sort of sense of an economic block to life goals, this also will, in a sense, allow, or we see a corresponding, in a sense, trend in rates of crime. Just as a side note, when you have an expansion of poverty that is made manifest in a geographic or community-wide sense, you create an environment for what another sociologist, James Henslins, describes as illegitimate opportunity structures. Illegitimate opportunity structures. So when you have an expansion of poverty that is made manifest in geographic or community-wide areas, you create an environment for what James Henslin says is a kind of illegitimate opportunity structure, or what environments provide for rapid criminal activity and, in a sense, some sort of benefit from participating in deviant behaviors. So that's another thing that you see in a lot of the sociological writing regarding this. Going back to Gary Lafree's work, another area, another exogenous effect that he identified had to do with politics. When there is a loss of the perceived authority of local and national governing bodies, we see a corresponding increase in criminal activities, especially in urban environments or in city environments. This can happen with a major change in leadership, or when the legitimacy of governing bodies is called into question due to scandal or even a lame duck kind of political environment. And we were seeing this off and on throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s. Of course, we have the Vietnam War era, and of course we have Watergate, and that was something that Lafree and others were seeing as definitely contributing to a sense of hopelessness among many people, and of course, correspondingly, a rise in deviance or deviant behavior. A third and final exogenic effect that is identified by Lafree is family disorganization, and this is something that gained a lot of attention in the 1970s and 1980s. When families are no longer able to either instill the institutional or socially acceptable values of the surrounding society, and of course even the members of the household itself, or when they no longer can regulate the behavior of their members, we start to see this disorganization occurring within the smaller scale social institution of the family. Now, sociologists have found that the more time that parents can spend, or the more time, in a sense, the parents spend away from the home, there is a greater sense of disorganization in the home and less social control occurring in the home. And so the idea here, and many sociologists were transfixed on this in the 1970s and 80s, was the amount of parent contact. When parents were having to work considerable hours away from the home and were not getting as much time to spend with their children, disorganization was something that they were starting to see in a variety of ways in the home itself. This then contributed as we saw a pattern develop across homes in a landscape, whether it's urban or rural, and the resulting trend, an upward trend in this case, deviant behavior in the sense of crime rates in those areas, that also started to occur. But endogenic processes as well become very important for the work of sociologists looking at, in this case, structural issues within a society. So public or municipal policy is something that is very important, and its effects on, in this case, things like crime become very, very important to the work of sociologists and, of course, theorists in criminal justice reform. So the primary actor in this case, when we look at public policy, is the criminal justice system, and this is something that is receiving a great deal of attention in our society today. Here, the work of the police, their philosophy, their training, and the prison system are the major actors in the U.S. criminal justice system and its health regarding pushing back against crime and reducing crime rates. Sociologist James Hendlin describes recidivism, or in this case, the return of individuals to incarcerated or incarceration-related settings, in this case, recidivism, in relation to the quality of the U.S. criminal justice system. So the idea here is that he's comparing rates of recidivism against what public policy is in place and the quality of that public policy. He cites a rate of 62% for violent crime offenders within a 3-year period of time from their release. And that is very high for our society. The idea here is that we would not want to see anything over 50% recidivism when it comes to a 2 or 3-year period of time after a one-time offender of the law who is now incarcerated or was incarcerated now is back in the system, and that's something to keep an eye on. That was a statistic initially built in 2003, but we see that trend continuing today. And in fact, as we approach 2008, it actually went up to 75% for a while there as well. So that is a concern, and sociologists are very much focusing on that. Now let's take a look at this trend and the need for potentially public policy really from two perspectives or two different angles. The first angle would be a police initiative. There is a divide, as we know, between police and the communities that they serve. However, law enforcement agencies have worked tirelessly to build a strong bond between themselves and their community. However, that is something that ultimately is important to continue to work on and establish. However, in areas where we have seen this establishment occurring, there ironically has not been a strong statistical effect on a reduction in crime. Where communities and police combine forces, the results sometimes can be different. So when we start to have communities being a little more proactive at the same time the police are developing a relationship, we can definitely start to see an impact there. In a study that was done in the late 1990s, homicide rates in New York decreased by over 100% when community policing initiatives were developed and supported. Things like block watches, town hall meetings with local officials, neighborhood patrols by police, and then of course civilians. And of course this has to be done in a safe manner, but needless to say, the more involved the community was, at the same time the police were developing strong relationships with members in that community, a immediate statistically significant trend in the reduction in crime was something that was being recorded. Before that, in the mid 1990s, homicides in New York numbered over 2,200. After these initiatives, and then into the early 2000s, this was it not only broke the 1,000 barrier, but it moved down below 900. So that's a very good trend. And again, something that sociologists were very much focusing in on. So the moral of the story here is that when you have police initiatives, crime can decrease, definitely, and there are correlations between these initiatives and crime rates. However, the community piece is a big part of it. A larger scale public institutions have to get involved. A second perspective or angle has to do with prison programs. So where you see prison programs focused on rehabilitation, there has been a number of studies that have identified pretty significant correlations with reductions in crime, and of course, there are strong correlations with a decline, a very linear correlation with a decline in rates of recidivism. Prison work programs, prisoner education programs have proven to have significant positive effects on reducing recidivism. What are generally referred to as rehabilitation and reentry programs for prisoners have also been very, very impactful. However, politics get involved, and sometimes these programs are underfunded or undervalued. And so the idea here is that we need a constant support trend until these programs can be a little more sustainable and self-sufficient, and then allow them to expand more naturally. So prison programs are actually identified as more impactful with regard to public policy and lowering rates of crime than what we see with police initiatives. The last material I'd like to share with you relates to the work of another sociologist, Miles Herr. His paramount work occurred in the mid 1990s. 1995 is when he published a variety of articles based upon his research, and he was taking a look at how education impacts recidivism. Again, how and why people may turn to crime to be able to re-regulate their lives or to achieve the goals or attempt to achieve the goals that they believe they need to attain when they feel that there are barriers within the society that are preventing that. And so he was looking at barriers in education and how reform in educational programs very much could have a positive impact on recidivism in the sense of lowering the rates of recidivism among individuals in a variety of communities and groups within American society. So here he identified that education, when it was deficient, when there was educational programs that were underfunded, after school programs, for example, or music or athletics, when some of these programs were cut back, he was starting to see correlated trends of juvenile delinquency, when he was also identifying or looking at, in this case, GRE programs, or GED programs rather, and then also programs that were focused on adult learners, when these were being reduced in terms of funding and the availability of the programs and seats within the programs. Again, there was this strong correlation to rates of crime and, of course, recidivism as well. Now, correlation, remember, is not causality. It's not the kind of thing where if you are reducing the funding for a particular program or devaluing a program that you're going to immediately cause crime to increase in a neighborhood. However, he was identifying that when those kinds of programs were not made available to social environments, that there was a corresponding increase in this case, crime, and individuals within those social landscapes were identified, and recidivism was also a trend that he was tracking out as well. He found, in terms of our two focuses or foci having to do with these different angles of public policy reform, that prison education reform appears to have been, or according to in this case Dr. Hare, appears to be the most impactful for reducing rates of recidivism in neighborhoods, in urban environments where individuals have, by trend, served in the correction environment. When those individuals have prison education programs that are made available to them, rates of recidivism literally will reverse. And so he was recognizing that not only do we have to make sure that our schools are in good shape in a variety of community environments, but for individuals who have broken the law and who have had to serve time because of felony level convictions or parole violations or a variety of other um, violent and nonviolent crimes that have resulted in their incarceration, when we attempt to provide educational benefits for them within and outside of the incarcerated landscape, we are seeing a very strong reduction in rates of recidivism. So think about this a little bit more deeply. Think about how these particular topics, including crime, impact what we are seeing in our society today and how it is structured. And also think very deeply about the role of social institutions in maintaining social order and organization within a variety of landscapes, both rural and urban, and how and what kinds of mechanisms we might use to maintain that order and to support social institutions, public, private, and otherwise, that are contributing directly to a breaking down of barriers and a promotion of healthy lifestyles.